So good morning. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session on the electricity market, risk and opportunities. My name is Elena Fumagalli. I will be chairing this session. I'm a professor at Utrecht University at the Geoscience faculty within the Department of Sustainable Development. I'm an energy engineer by training, but always I've worked at the boundaries between economics and engineering. So it is with great pleasure that I want to introduce today's session. We have four speakers. We have two talks that are theoretical and two talks that are applied, empirical work. So we will start with Tarun Khanna speaking about the responsiveness of electricity demand to price variations in the short term, indeed an empirical work. And Tarun is a PhD candidate at Hertie School in Berlin, correct, I hope. And he was previously visiting researcher at the International Energy Agency, but also a consultant in his previous life with Price Waterhouse. Welcome. We will continue with two theoretical works. One is from Yue Ting Yu. She is looking at alternative auction designs for wholesale electricity market, and she wants to understand which auction format between pay-as-speed and uniform price is superior in providing bidding incentives and investment incentives. That's at least my understanding from the outset. And she's also a doctoral student at Tilburg University. She has a research master in economics. So welcome also to you, Yue Ting. And then we continue with Dongchen He, also from Tilburg University, studying the optimal procurement of reserves in wholesale electricity market. And Dongchen He is also a PhD candidate from Tilburg University. She holds a master in economics and also a master in finance. Welcome. And then we have our last speaker, Arushi Mahian. She is looking at the role of cross-border trade in the expansion of the penetration of renewables in energy markets. And she has a master in economics from Punjab University. She is currently a doctoral student from Thapar School of Management. Welcome. I'm guessing you're calling from India, but where you study? Yes, okay. Welcome to you as well. So because we have four speakers, I think we can have 15 minutes presentations. And I would suggest that we allow some questions after each presentation so that we are on topic. And if we have time, then we can have more questions at the end, only if time allows. So I will start with giving the floor to Tarun.
Thank you, Elena. And thank you for those nice introductions. So yes, I'll be presenting a work that is part of my doctoral thesis. It's a joint paper written with Professor Leon Hitt and Oliver Runau at the Hertie School. It's a relatively fresh piece of work, so it's a working paper that we hope to come out with soon. So it's a really good, it's really great to present it here, and hopefully looking forward to some critical feedback from all of you. So the topic, of course, as you mentioned, is it's an empirical work where we try and estimate the short-term elasticity of electricity demand in Germany. So the basic research question was, how does hourly aggregate electricity demand in Germany respond to changes in day-ahead prices in the wholesale markets of electricity? And I want to highlight two words over here. So one is that we want to understand the responsiveness of aggregate electricity demand, so not the demand that is bid into electricity markets or electricity demand of a particular industry or a particular sector, but the overall aggregate demand of the entire system. And the second thing that I want to highlight is the fact that we want to look at the responsiveness to day-ahead prices in the wholesale market. So the explanatory variable or the causal relationship is derived from prices in the wholesale markets of electricity in the day-ahead auctions. And we think this is interesting because, I mean, elasticity of demand is always an interesting topic, but importantly, it is an important input into electricity market models and analyses. And in our separate work, all three of us, Leon, I, and Runau, we work in integration of wind and solar power. Arushi will be presenting some work today, and demand side response has again and again been cited as a critical way of incorporating more renewables into the system. But our really interesting point was, yes, we want more system flexibility in the long run, but really, what is the system flexibility now? Like, how flexible and how responsive are consumers to changes in electricity prices, even with the current day-ahead auction setup? Of course, there are other advantages of having a flexible demand side approach. So it can serve as a useful backup capacity, requiring for lower amounts of peak load capacity on the supply side. Of course, we're not the first ones to look at this literature. There have been several studies before which look at individual sectoral demands, and they try to measure the bottom-up flexibility of existing consumers. So there have been many sort of experimental studies looking at industrial consumers, households, which try and assess how responsive these groups of consumers are to retail prices mostly, and other forms of retail price interventions. As far as we know, aggregate demand has not been looked at very concretely. There are studies that look at aggregate demand from electricity markets, but they tend to focus more on the long-term issues. So I think this is really comes from an old tradition in economics as well, where people try and assess the impact of long-term changes in energy prices, for example, on demand. So, but as far as we know, we're trying to do here something which is novel, where combining aggregate demand with very short-term changes in prices. So of course, the relationship between wholesale electricity price and demand is not a straightforward one. It's a bidirectional relationship. Electricity price leads to change in electricity demand, and electricity demand, of course, then also leads to change in price. We are trying to understand, however, or trying to tease out the causal relationship, which is from the electricity price to electricity demand. So just to note that in Germany, this relationship is, of course, mediated for a large number of consumers through the retail price of electricity, as in many other countries. So most consumers, for example, most households in Germany do not face the wholesale prices of electricity. They only look at retail prices. There are, however, certain groups of households who are subject to real-time pricing, which is linked to day-ahead prices in the wholesale markets. But importantly, in Germany, there's a large section of industrial consumers, and industrial demand constitutes about 50% of overall demand in Germany. So these industrial consumers can choose to buy electricity directly from the wholesale markets. It's totally liberalized. And while there is not very good data in terms of how many choose to do this and at how much time, industrial consumers are completely flexible in their ability to choose procure electricity directly from the wholesale market, so they are at least exposed to them. How do we try and tease out a causal relationship from something which is very much a bidirectional relationship? Well, we try and implement a really sort of old technique in economics, which is the instrument variable estimation technique. And we use, again, an instrument which is sort of a classical instrument that has been used in economics, which is weather. When we don't use weather directly, we use weather in terms of wind generation. So we look at consider the amount of electricity generated from wind energy as an instrument for our purpose. Now, to serve as a good instrument, wind generation needs to meet two criteria. One is the relevance criteria, which says that wind energy generation should be highly correlated with wholesale electricity prices. And this has been, of course, proven to be true in previous studies. And there's a very well-established relationship, which is somewhat linear in nature, between amount of electricity wind generation and wholesale prices of electricity. Of course, the second condition being is of course that wind should not be related with electricity demand in any other way except through wholesale prices. This is called the so-called exogeneity condition. And here we believe that wind, which is related directly to weather patterns or is mostly influenced by weather patterns, serves as a good instrument. There is also a long tradition in economics in using weather as an instrument for this particular reason. Of course, there can be some challenges to this, and we address them in our analysis. However, there's one clear way in which weather is also related both to wind and electricity demand, which is through the ambient temperature. And we control for this using various measures for temperature in our analysis. Alongside that, there are well-known and probably well-studied variations in time of the day, month, and year impact on both the electricity price and electricity demand. And we want to control for these seasonal sort of variations and diurnal and weekly variations in our analysis, so that we can tease out, to the extent possible, a relationship which is only between price and demand. We do so by incorporating several of these variables in our analysis. This is just to recap what I just said. So moving on, how do we do this? Well, we've set up 5 different model specifications. We use several model specifications for 2 reasons. First, there is sort of no, at least a priori, we thought we can't really be sure whether the relationship between wholesale market prices and demand is linear or log linear or any other sort of functional form that we don't understand. So we try and fit both a linear, a log linear, and a non-parametric relationship between demand and price. You probably noticed that we don't include a log-log specification, which would directly estimate an elasticity. That's because prices in Germany in the last years have been negative, and then including a log-log specification was not possible for that reason. The second reason we also have several specifications is because we wanted to control for these influence of seasons, weather, energy prices, so coal and gas prices in our analysis. But again, the relationship of these variables with the quantities of our interest, which is demand and price, was something that was not, that could be linear, it could be other functional forms. So we tried to include sort of parametric, non-parametric forms of these relationships as well, using our approach. So we essentially estimate two classes of models, a parametric and a non-parametric model, and within them we estimate these various relationships. So the parametric models look something like this, where the first stage regression, in the first stage regression, we regress price on our main instrument, which is wind energy generation, and a whole bunch of controls, including solar energy generation, proxies for temperature, coal, gas, and CO2 prices, and dummies for various hour of the day, weekday, and month of the year. We then use the price estimate. In our second stage equation, we take demand as a function of all the controls and the estimated, let's say, price that we get from the first stage equation. This is the so-called two-stage least squares estimator approach. Notice that we use the 2SLS approach, but we also use the HAC consistent standard errors to control for serial correlation in errors. The non-parametric models look something like this. So they're very similar, except that the approach itself is similar in the sense that it's two-staged, but within each stage, the functional form is very different. It's each of these stage equations is a generalized additive model, and the two-stage approach is something that is pioneered by Radis and Mara, and that's where we derive the estimator from. The basic difference is that we do not specify a functional form for the relationship between the dependent variable, which is price or demand in this first stage or the second stage, and the independent variables on the right-hand side, which are price, solar generation, again, ambient temperature, and the various energy prices. I'm sorry, Lena, how am I doing on time? Do I need to hurry up? You're on mute, sorry.
Still a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay, so that should really move very quickly. Well, we see that from our first stage that our instruments is very much relevant and we have a good R-square. So I'm going to skip through this quickly. These are main model results where we find that the response, we have about 8, depending on the model, we find a 70 to 80 megawatt response or change in, let's say, demand to a €1 per megawatt hour change in electricity price. We also, the signs of all the control variables are very much plausible and the relationships seem very interesting. Also, a lot of non-linear relationships between controls, which are very plausible and have good explanatory power. The models overall have very good explanatory power. The non-linear ones even better so than the linear ones. So just to recap the results broadly again, for the mean value of price and demand, the derived elasticity of demand are somewhere between 0.5 and 0.04. Now this might seem relatively low, or like a 70-80 megawatt estimate in change in demand might seem relatively low, but I think we have to put it in context. So considering like a normal variation in wind generation, which is a 5 to 95 percentile, we consider that this corresponds to roughly a €26 per megawatt hour change in prices using our first stage equation, which corresponds to about 2 gigawatts variation in demand, or that's 4% of the average demand in Germany. This is actually substantially larger amount of flexibility than what is normally understood in the literature. So, and our estimates are very robust to various measures and higher than what has been previously cited in the literature. We also find that the nonlinear relationship between price and demand. So the nonlinear relationship is very much statistically significant, and there's this big kink in the relationship at sort of normal or median prices, which we couldn't really understand. But we tried to do some more digging and try and really understand that later on. I'm going to quickly also, given that I have maybe a few more minutes, run through the various sensitivities and robustness checks that we have done. We sort of split the data set for different years, seasons, between weekday and weekends, to try and see if there are variations in the demand estimates. And broadly, the results are actually quite robust across these different time slices. We do find significant differences in the elasticity or responsiveness between weekends and weekdays, where demand is much more responsive during weekdays as compared to weekends, and is much more responsive during weekdays as compared to the nighttime hours. Further, what we find is that the shape of the demand curve is fairly linear during the daytime hours, actually, and is relatively similar to what we find for the linear demand curve. In fact, there is no, the GAM model actually doesn't really find a reason to necessarily fix a nonlinear model for the daytime hours at all. But the nighttime hours, the relationship is very much nonlinear. So the shape of the demand curve is very much nonlinear for the nighttime hours. Which again makes us think that maybe it does fit in well with the understanding that it's industrial consumers who are maybe responding more to prices, and maybe that's more during weekdays and more during daytime hours compared to night. Another sort of check that we did was look at regional differences across Germany. So looking at the different TSOs in Germany and their areas, we looked at only the demand in the separate TSO areas and fit our models in that. And what we find is that for two of the TSOs, the demand response is much stronger compared to the others. And interestingly, the TSO for which the demand response is the highest, which is Amprion, is also the area, also covers the area in Germany which has most of the heavy industry in Germany, which again matches well with the understanding that demand response that we are observing comes from industrial consumers only. So we find our results, therefore, to be fairly sensible and robust across time slices. We also do a number of robustness checks to check the exogeneity condition of wind energy. And we also use some other instruments to check if we get some different sort of results. We use wind speed in one of the model specifications and wind and solar energy both as an instrument in one of the model specifications. But what we find is that our results are fairly robust, even with changing the model specification a little bit. We also estimate, we also try and address serial correlation, which is a problem area in time series models, and use different ways of addressing this concern. Broadly, we use the FGLS method as well to try and fit the model, which gives us very similar results. The estimates are slightly lower, but still very much significant and of the same order of magnitude. Our first difference model gives us actually even higher estimates, which indicates that there is some difference in the first order and subsequent order of effects in terms of price or lag prices on demand. And this is something that we will explore in the work as we go along further. So just to recap, we find a fairly strong relationship between electricity prices and aggregate demand in Germany. The demand curve is strongly non-linear during nighttime, but fairly linear during daytime. Our estimates for regional distribution match well with the regional distribution of energy in intensive industry. And our results are fairly robust to model specification and sensitivity checks. So I guess I will stop at this point. Sorry for being a little over time.
Thank you so much. Very interesting work. Are there any questions, suggestions for Tarun at the moment?
Yeah, so I have one question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I wonder if there is price difference between the electricity used by industry and the electricity used by consumers. Like for the price, do you mean the aggregate price for both household and industry, or you do the subsample?
Yeah, so the price that we use is the day-ahead price from wholesale market. So it's the auction price in the day-ahead market. It's the same price. So because households normally are not exposed directly to this price, they will not see this. Households pay the retail price of electricity, which is equal to this wholesale price of electricity, plus a number of taxes and surcharges, including the renewable energy subsidy surcharge. So the day-ahead prices actually form a relatively small part of the overall price that households pay. In Germany, industries actually don't pay any renewable energy surcharge. So they only pay on top of the day-ahead price a lower amount of tax and surcharges. But still, they also do have pay a fair amount of network fee. So there are differences between the electricity prices faced by consumers, different categories of consumers. But the price that we are looking at is the day-ahead price, which is like the base price, which is paid by everyone in any case.
Yeah, so then I don't understand how you test and get the results that like the industry consumers are more sensitive than the household. Yeah, like if the result is that the industry demand is elastic to the wholesale market price, I won't be surprised by that. Yeah, but
yes,
but then how?
So there's no way to directly observe this, right? But we think this is the case because industries can buy electricity directly from the wholesale markets, whereas most households can't. So we think that we don't know, right? We can't be 100% sure, but we are. I think all the analysis points in that direction, that the elasticity that we are seeing comes from industry, because industry is also able to directly buy electricity from the wholesale markets at the wholesale prices. So households are not able to participate directly in the wholesale prices. They are dependent on retailers. And mostly households actually just pay a single flat price throughout the year. They don't necessarily pay different prices, which are linked to the price of yesterday or of the hour that they're consuming it. Whereas industries can change their demand quite proactively, and they have incentive to do so because they can buy and sell directly in the wholesale market.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I will ask you to hold any further questions on this work until the end. So let's try to hear the other presentations, and then hopefully we can come back with more questions on your work. Very interesting, Tarun. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll give the floor to Yueting Yu.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to present this project, Bidding and Investment in Wholesale Electricity Markets, Past Bid Auction versus Uniform Price Auction. This is a joint work with Bert Williams, and we are still working on it, so you are most welcome to give any comments after my presentation. So electricity is a non-storable commodity, and in this sense, supply must meet demand at all times. Basically, there are two ways to organize wholesale markets, uniform price auction or pay-as-bid auction. In either auction, bids by producers are represented by the step function, and its intersection with the demand curve gives the market clearing price P star. In a uniform price auction, all the winning consumers, they pay exactly the market clearing price. However, in a pay-as-bid auction, all the winners, they pay what they bid. That is P1, P2, and P3. And the green region represents the consumer surplus. Then some people may argue that the consumer surplus and the pay-as-bid auction is obviously greater than that in a uniform price auction, but that is not true because producers, they behave differently in the two auctions, so the step functions may not be the same. So here we ask the question, which method is better? To be more specific with our question, we compare these two multi-unit auction formats in short term and in long term. In short term, we look at their bidding behaviors and price cost markups. However, in long term, we compare firms' investment decisions and generation portfolio, and this is novel compared to the existing literature. In our paper, we construct a perfect computation model with uncertain and elastic demand. And we also consider a continuum of generation technologies from baseload to peak load. Of course, we are not the first to compare pay-as-bid auction and uniform price auction. So here is a collection of existing literature in this topic. In our model, we construct a perfect computation model. And in previous literature, there are all sorts of model: perfect computation, monopoly, supply function equilibrium, and duopoly. And in our paper, we consider infinitely many technologies, which, as you can see in previous literature, most of them only consider short-run equilibrium without taking into account the investment. As for the results, in our paper, we find there is a decrease in consumer surplus with pay-as-bid auction, which is different from the existing literature. And finally, regarding welfare, we have similar results with Federico and Raman, and all the rest literature, since they consider inelastic demand, there is no welfare effect. We find that in short term, firms submit bids higher than marginal cost, and hence consumers' willingness to pay is higher than marginal cost. This can be translated to a distortion in consumption decision. And in the long term, we find that revenue of baseload producers is depressed during high demand, which means a distortion in generation mix. So in the following, I'll talk about the model and bidding and investment equilibrium, and also with an example, and finally give some summary. On the supply side, we consider a continuous set of technologies with marginal cost from 0 all the way up to C upper bar. And C upper bar represents the value of lost load, which means that the consumers, they experience a blackout and they get the compensation. We consider this as the highest technology in our model. And the investment cost function K of C represents the technology frontier. And we have assumption on K of C upper bar and K prime of C upper bar. In our model, there are infinitely many small firms that can invest in technology C. Then we can write down the expected profit, which is the expected transfer minus the investment cost minus the marginal cost times the expected capacity factor, which means the probability of production. And on the demand side, consumers are price takers. And in our inverse demand function, there is a stochastic term. And we use elastic demand function. This stochastic term is normalized in such a way that this stochastic term is exactly the intercept. Exactly the intercept. We normalize by P of 0 equals 0. And we have assumption on the distribution of the demand shock. And we assume the distribution function is known. And we also define the contour function. The strategy set of firms in our model is B of C and G of C. B of C represents space by firm with marginal cost C, and G of C represents the total installed capacity with marginal cost less or equal than C. Then the following figure illustrates the market clearing condition. When the demand realization is epsilon, then this demand function together with this bidding function gives the market clearing price and the market clearing quantity. And this quantity together with this installed capacity function gives the marginal technology C. So instead of indexing everything with the demand shock, we index everything with marginal power plant C for convenience. And the market clearing condition, as I just mentioned, gives the marginal technology. And here we have epsilon of C, which means the demand shock for which firm of type C is on the margin. Then we also have the capacity factor and the expected revenue T of C, and the uniform price auction is calculated by this marginal bid times the probability of winning. And in past bid auction, it's simply just the bid times its capacity factor. Then what constitutes a competitive bidding and investment equilibrium? First, we need several assumptions. Producers invest and bid before demand shock is realized. And producers are price takers. They take the stochastic distribution of prices as given. And we also assume there is no entry barrier for our long-term equilibrium. Then for short term, firms set B of C to maximize profit for a given stochastic price distribution. The price distribution should be consistent with market clearing condition. And in the long term, firms make zero expected profit. Then in our bidding equilibrium, the optimal bidding strategies follow the first order conditions, which is consistent with the federal environment's results. In a uniform price auction is exactly firms bid their marginal cost. However, in a pay as bid auction, there is a markup, which is inverse hazard rate. If we look at this expression, we can observe that in a pay as bid auction, there is a trade-off between a higher markup and a higher probability of being scheduled. If we relate to single unit auction, it's kind of similar to first price auction. However, Z of P here is endogenous and it depends on B of C. So if we solve for the optimal bid B of C and capacity factor, we will obtain a differential equation. We are still working on this part. And then we come to the investment equilibrium. The free entry condition gives this h of c equals negative k prime of c. And we can see the intuition behind through a screening curve. Screening curve basically says that which technology is the cheapest depends on capacity factor H. And if we plot the total production cost against the capacity factor for a peak load technology and a base load technology, gas turbine and nuclear power here for an example, we can see that for the peaker, the cost starts from a lower capacity cost, but it is steeper because the marginal cost is higher. So there must be an intersection between the two curves. And this gives the capacity factor, which means at this point, these two technologies are equally cheap. And this is consistent with the lemma we have here. So in the investment equilibrium, a firm with technology C bases its marginal cost in uniform price auction and levelized cost in pay-as-bid auction. And if we calculate the learner index, we can find that it equals the inverse of elasticity of investment cost. This markup is not due to market power, but it is necessary to recoup investment cost. And then we can calculate the installed capacity, the other decision variable from market clearing condition. And then I'll illustrate our idea with a functional form model. Here we assume linear demand function, investment cost function in this form, and uniformly distributed demand shocks. And first we look at the graph on the left. The solid lines represent the bidding strategies and the pay-as-bid auction and uniform price auction. We can see that from baseload to upload, there is always a markup in pay-as-bid auction except for the top. If we come to the investment decisions, we can see that the aggregate capacity is identical and the two auctions. However, for the base load, pay-as-bid auction has higher base load, has lower base load investment. And since they have to enter the same peak load, the same aggregate investment, or the intermediate investment is higher in pay-as-bid auction. So the generation mix is distorted. So in our model, we assume that firms make zero profit. So welfare equals is exactly the consumer surplus. Uniform price auction is efficient. So the consumer surplus and the uniform price auction is higher. And we can see that consumer surplus with high demand is higher because the volume is almost the same here, but the price paid by the consumer is lower because the consumer paid the bid instead of the market clearing price. However, for low demand like this, the volume is lower, but the price consumers pay is higher. So this results a lower consumer surplus with low demand. To summarize what we have in this project so far, our research speaks to the question how auction formats affect short-term bidding decision and long-term investment decision. And we find that inefficiency doesn't necessarily come from the market power. It could also come from market design. And the pay-as-bid auction, we find in short term, there is allocative efficiency where consumers' willingness to pay is higher than producers' marginal cost. And in the long run, there is a distortion in generation mix. Revenue for baseload technology is distorted downwards and incentive for investment decrease. So regarding our future research, first of all, we want to look at a different shape of the installed capacity and allow for some bunching, which means the intermediate technologies are not used. And we also want to introduce market power in a monopoly setting. This is what we have already got some preliminary results on this, but we need to think more about the intuition behind. So yeah, that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very clear, I think. Do we have any questions for Yue Ting at the moment? Any suggestions for future work, maybe? How to continue with this? I do have a suggestion, maybe. So I find that this seems to be a very interesting topic. At the same time, I see that maybe you could make it a little bit more related to current trends in electricity markets. For instance, when you have your example, you speak about gas-fired and nuclear power plants. You assume that, yes, demand has uncertainty, but we will see, hopefully, more and more in the future, more intermittent renewables on the supply side. This means that it could be that there might be some adjustments that you need to make on your supply curve to take into account a larger share of renewables, which have a different type of total cost function, and also present uncertainties on the supply side as well, and not only from the demand side, unless you consider the demand curve as a net curve, which also discounts for the production from renewables. So I would suggest maybe to add something, at least in your narrative, if not in your model, that maybe captures the current trends in European markets, which are the ones that I know best. We're speaking about a mix of generation that is changing quite rapidly, actually.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. I think we are not including renewable energies a lot in our model because the main issue is intermittency, and it's like a more complicated setting. And I think we will think about that in our future work. Thank you for your suggestion.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot. Any other comments in the meantime? All right, then let's move on to our third speaker. We still might have time in the end for further questions. Chen.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me clearly.
We can hear you fine.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And morning, everyone. And this is Chen. I'm from Tilburg University, and today I would like to present to you with my first research project called "When Are Reserves Needed?" the co-optimization of energy and reserves in electricity markets with multiple technologies. And for today's pre, I would like to first give you a short introduction, which is about my research question and my motivation of this paper. And after that, we go to a little bit details about my model. And after that, I would like to change the model a little bit by introducing the intermittency of renewables, that is the supply uncertainty. And finally, we have a brief conclusion of this paper. So first introduction, we know that electricity is a very special product because it's uncertain demand and supply. So to secure the electricity supply, we define a lot of market elements, and these markets can provide products like energy, reserves, capacity, as well as many other financial products. So with so many different electricity markets, we are asked one question. The energy and the reserves, they are both short-term and they are procured for continuously matching the demand and supply. So why do we need both? If we are afraid of shortage of supply, we can buy more extra energy or we use reserves. So that is why I think reserves and energy can be regarded as substitutes. And the second question, so the sequential question is, why can we co-optimize them to minimize cost and single price of each? And so for this topic, we have some related strand of literature. And the first one is about how to justify the existence of reserves. And there are two reasons in the literature. The first reason is to say that reserves are a way to provide reliability. So it is a very lateral reason, but as I said before, the extra energy can also play the same role. And the second reason says that reserves are financial hedges. So for this reason, it regards reserves as a call option, which is very similar to the call option in financial markets. So it says that we buy reserves because we want to deal with price uncertainty and demand uncertainty in the spot markets. So if in the spot markets, the spot price is very high, then we can activate reserves and then we just need to pay the executive price. So that is also how short-term reserves play in the UK electricity market. And the second related literature is about the reserves market design. And so for this field, we still have a lot of work to do because auction design in reserves markets is very complicated. Yeah. And the third strand of literature is about the co-optimization of energy and reserves. So as far as I know, we don't have a lot of economic paper, especially economic theoretic paper, to talk about the difference between co-optimization and separate optimization of energy and reserves. But we do have some from the engineering perspective. So there are some engineering papers to compare the co-optimization and the sequential optimization of energy and reserves. And by solving a very complicated optimization programming, their conclusion are that we can reduce the operation cost by co-optimizing the energy and reserves. So how about my paper? In my paper, I will propose a simple economic model in which energy and reserves are co-optimized. And by solving this model, I give another reason for the existence of reserves. Also, I will give the state contingent dispatch loads of both reserves and energy. After that, I will talk about how should we select technologies. Like there are a lot of technologies available, so how should we select from them to provide energy and reserves? So the general results are like, first, the reserves and energy can be regarded as two types of co-options. So that is why I think they are substitutes. And the second, I found that if we do not consider the supply uncertainty, then reserves are not necessary. So we can find a threshold of the standby cost for reserves. Only when the standby cost is lower than the threshold, we need to buy reserves instead of energy. However, if we consider the increasing use of renewables, we will find that reserves become necessary. It's become important. And finally, we can find a convex line of the technology frontier, such that only the technologies lying on this line will be used to provide energy or reserves. So let's look at the model. And so in the model, I assume there are N technologies available to produce one type of non-storable goods. Of course, we mainly talk about electricity, and we assume it's very hard to store it. And we can produce the good in two ways. The first way is energy, and second is reserves. So for the energy, we assume you only need to incur the production cost if you buy energy. However, if your dispatched load is lower than what you planned before, then you can reduce the production. So that is the flexibility of energy. However, it is not totally flexible. So to reduce the production, you can only recoup part of the production cost. That means as long as you planned some amount of energy, there incurs a sunk cost. And for the reserves, it is a little bit different. For the reserves, you pay some standby costs. So the standby cost is similar to the option price. And by paying this standby cost, you get the right to activate it to produce electricity when you need it. And if you activate the reserves, you will pay extra production cost. However, if you do not activate it, you don't need to pay this extra production cost. So that is mean the energy and the reserves, they have very similar cost structure, but it's different in the amount. So that's why I call them different kinds of call options. The trade-off between energy and the reserves is that for the energy, it has a higher production cost, but it has a lower standby cost. So it has a lower option cost. That is the trade-off between these two kinds of products. If there is no trade-off, like if for energy, it has both lower production costs and lower option cost, then we do not need to buy any reserves because it costs more. And for the demand side, I will just assume the demand is stochastic and inelastic. So I assume that the demand is equal to the state of the world, epsilon, and the demand is inelastic up to a reservation price. I assume the reservation price U is a function of the state of the world, epsilon, and it is an increasing and concave function because it's intuitively like if you have more demands, the consumers are willing to pay a higher price for it. And so because we assume the demand is inelastic, it is possible that the market does not clear. So the market is not clear. It comes from two resources. First, there can be a shortage of supply. It means that when the state of the world is realized, you find that the demand epsilon is larger than what you planned before T. And the second is rationing. It means in some states, the cost of producing electricity is larger than the benefit of it. And in this case, you deliberately decrease the production of electricity. So because of the market's not clear, we give another notation, which is the dispatched load, the epsilon. Its mass base smaller or equal to the minimal of supply and demand. So actually, we are talking about a two-stage game. At the first stage, you choose how much energy and how much reserves are available to be dispatched. And after that, the state of the word epsilon is realized. And after it's realized, you choose the dispatched load, which is dependent on the state of the word epsilon. And after you choose the dispatch load, the consumption will occur. And so for that, we can write the ex ante expectation and the expected cost. For the expectation, at each state, it is equal to the willingness to pay times the demand, D, and we integral it over the whole range of states. For the expected cost, it's similar, but it consists of the cost for energy plus the cost for reserves. And to get some insights, firstly, we can simplify the model to assume there is only one technology available. So by solving the model, we know that at the second stage, we can get the efficient dispatching. So the efficient dispatching depends on what's the state now, and if at some states the willingness to pay is smaller than the production cost of energy, then you will not use any energy or reserves, so the dispatch load will be 0. However, if the willingness to pay is between the production cost of energy but smaller than the production cost of reserves, you will only use energy. So the dispatched load will be equal to Q epsilon. So Q epsilon is the dispatched energy. And if the willingness to pay is high enough, in this case, you will both call the energy and reserves. So the dispatched load will be the minimal of demand or supply. And then it's about the shadow price. So the shadow price, it means what is the value of extra energy and extra reserves. And so we can see that for the extra reserves, for the extra energy, it is 0 before the demand is larger than the energy you planned, because in this case, your consumption will be at most the demand. So extra energy is useless. And that's the same reason for the shadow price of extra reserve. And the second thing is that we can see that the extra energy and the difference between extra energy and extra reserve is actually the difference. So that means in some case, if you consume energy instead of reserve, you can save beta C, what is the sunk cost of energy. Yeah, so that is also why I think we should co-optimize energy and reserves. If not, we cannot get the opportunity cost of each, and that will underestimate the value of each. Oh, sorry, to overestimate the value of each. And then we can go to the first stage. So for the first stage, we give the optimal procurement of energy and reserves, and we can find there exists a unique threshold K, only if the standby cost smaller than K, we will buy both energy and reserves. And you can see it's the first order equation is just like the value of a co-option should be equal to the cost of it. So the left-hand side is the value of a co-option. Yeah, I think we are running out of time, so I will jump to next slide. Yeah, so So next, we consider the multiple technology. There are two differences in this setup. The first thing is that even though we have N technologies available, we only use a subset of technologies for energy and a subset technologies for reserves. And the second is that we can find the allocation of reserves and energy among different technologies. So how should we allocate the amount of it among different technologies? So we can see that there is a convex line. Only the and the convex line is the efficient technology frontier. Only the technologies lying on this line will be used for producing energy and reserves. If there is technologies above the line, it is inefficient. It means you have to pay more for producing the same unit of technology of electricity, and the technology below the line is unavailable. And finally, we
can you keep it below a minute still?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It almost finished. Thank you. And finally, we add supply uncertainty. So for the supply uncertainty, we give a simple model. We assume there are two technologies, the renewables and traditional technology. And we assume the traditional technology will be certain. So the availability factor is equal to 1. But for the renewables, the availability factor is between 0 to 1. So it is possible that only part of the generation is available. So after adding these new elements, we will find that the total supply should be larger. It's intuitive because it's possible that part of the generation will break down. And the second thing is that we found reserves will become necessary if the renewables, like the availability of renewables, will be very low. Yeah, so that's from this figure. That is because if we do not consider the intermittent renewables, we underestimate the value of traditional generation and we overestimate the value of renewables. And this will, and after we add the supply uncertainty, we will push up the value of traditional generation and we will drag down the value of renewables, which gives more space for the reserves. Yeah, so actually the implication of this paper is that if we do not consider supply uncertainty, we don't think reserves are necessary. However, if the intermittency renewables are integrated, renewables will become more important. So that is how we give another reason for the existence of reserves. And the second implication is that all technologies are efficient to provide energy or reserves. And the selection of technologies depend on the cost trade-off and the uncertainties we would consider. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm running out of time.
Yes, thank you, Dong Chen. It's very interesting work. I think it makes for a very good link with actually all the engineering work on the same topic, which is, as you mentioned, quite a lot. I would love to keep talking about this a little bit longer, but we're really running out of time. We have your slides and we'll come back to you eventually with more suggestions and questions. Right now, I really need to give the floor to our last speaker. Sorry, Arushi. She has an empirical work to present. And the floor is yours. You do have 15 minutes plus a question or two.
Thank you. Excuse me for my voice because I have cough from a couple of days. So I'm sorry if you'll not be able to comprehend what I'm saying.
No, we hear you fine.
So the title that I'm going to present today is Renewable Energy Proliferation for Energy Security, the Role of Cross-Border Electricity Trade in that. And my co-authors are Dr. Amit Prakash Jha and Dr. Sanjay Kumar Singh. So we have been witnessing a transition that has been happening from conventional sources of energy, particularly coal, to greener and more cleaner sources of energy, which are the renewable energy sources. Therefore, in order to achieve energy security, it is necessary that the conventional energy sources are supplemented with the renewable energy sources, and these both sources of energy must supplement each other in order to achieve energy security. That is why in this paper, we highlight renewable energy production and we focus on renewable energy production because its promotion is necessary, because it not only will aid in energy security, and it aids already in energy security, but it also facilitates sustainable development at the same time. Talking of sustainable development, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are also known as the Global Goals, they were adopted by the United Nations in 2015, and there are 17 goals in total. Out of these 17 goals, the 7th goal is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So we, from the Sustainable Development Goals, we understand how important clean energy is for the development of the society. That is why we are targeting particularly renewable energy for achieving energy security, because it is clean and it is green. Energy is definitely a necessity, but the fossil fuel based energy sources, which are still predominant globally, they are detrimental to the environment. And the literature has also highlighted the environmental effects of energy production. Greenhouse gases that result from energy use, they are doing more and more damage to the healthy development of society. Thus, there's a need to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. What can be a prominent mitigation strategy then in order to reduce this negative effect? A prominent mitigation strategy is to replace the polluting fossil fuel-based resources with the renewable energy resources. Yes, we have highlighted the advantages of using renewable energy, but yes, we must also understand that there are multiple barriers to its proliferation, and some of my co-presenters have highlighted the problem of intermittency and reliability already. Apart from the barriers like technical barriers, there are institutional barriers, there are economic barriers such as high cost is involved in renewable energy production, and market barriers such as inconsistent pricing structures. There are these 3 barriers that are very important for renewable energy proliferation: intermittency, reliability, and market size. When we talk of intermittency, we all know that solar power is intermittent in the sense that it is available only during the daytime, only during a particular period. Secondly, reliability, it's mainly related with the wind. It's mainly related with wind, and the wind velocity needs to stay within the desired band if we want to generate electricity from it. Market size is yet another critical determinant for renewable energy growth. What can be the potential solution then? That's the question. In order to promote renewable energy expansion, cross-border electricity trade, it can offer potential solution. It offers potential solutions to the problems that I highlighted in the previous slide, and it provides a new direction for energy security and also sustainable development because it accrues positive effects on the renewable energy production. Strong cross-border interconnections, they have direct economic benefits, and they also decrease the generators' possibility to exercise market power basically. And it will also increase the security of supply for all the partners that are trading. And it will also help in lowering the risk on investments that are made. And cross-border electricity trade can provide solution to a certain extent to the problems of intermittency and reliability. And it will open the door for nations to a larger market, and hence integrating the national renewable energy markets, it does make sense here. And also the trade costs, they are not very high in utilities such as electricity. Taking you through a brief literature background in the research gap, Ahmed et al. 2017, they found that integrated ASEAN power grid, it can enhance the power generation from countries, and from abundant to the deficit nations, the energy can flow. Huck et al. 2020 also demonstrated that for Bangladesh, cross-border electricity trade accrues positive benefits. And several studies point out that in South Asia also, because studies have done region-wise case studies, and they have found that in South Asia also cross-border electricity trade has potential economic gains, and it has solved the energy problem in those countries. The macroeconomic theory, when we look at the macroeconomic theory, that also provides convincing arguments for the support of significant and positive effects of international trade on output and growth. And there are further empirical evidences on the dynamic relationship between output, energy production, and international trade. Yet, there are hardly any empirical studies that explore the relationship that exists between cross-border electricity trade and renewable energy production, and that guides our study. There are two basic research questions that we have here. The first is we are trying to look at what is the causal direction between the renewable energy production and the cross-border electricity trade. The second is how are these variables related. Talking of the data, we have a data set of 35 countries, and most of these countries are these belong to OECD and BRICS nations. Why we have taken OECD and BRICS nations only? Because they comprise 90% of the world's renewable energy production, and we have excluded the island nations here because it is not cost effective for the island nations to engage in electricity trade because of the geographical barriers. And the data that we have taken from is from 1990 to 2018, so 29 years. And we have extracted the data from International Energy Agency and World Bank. Now, talking of the methods that we used to investigate research question 1 and the second research question, we have used basically non-parametric methods so as to avoid the specification of a potentially unsuitable functional form that functional relationship that exists between the dependent and the independent variables. That is why we have assumed the non-parametric method, and also because there was no a priori theoretical functional form that we found from the literature. That's why we used a non-parametric methods here. In research question 1, which is regarding the causal direction, we have used the panel grandeur causality test, and we have followed the procedure proposed by Dumitrescu and Hurley in 2012. And for the research question 2, about how are these variables related, we have applied non-parametric kernel regression on lines of Lee and Racine, 2004. So we are applying panel data methods through a non-parametric approach, and the goal of the analysis is to explore what is the role of economic output, GDP basically, and cross-border electricity trade in promoting renewable energy production. You can look at the basic model in equation 1, where R is the renewable energy generation, and it is measured in gigawatt hour. XM is the total cross-border electricity trade. It is exports plus imports, and it is also measured in gigawatt hour. Y is the GDP or the output, and it is measured in purchasing power parity terms. We've taken constant 2011 international dollars here. And we've also modeled the country and time effects, and these are obviously the categorical variables. In kernel regression, which is a non-parametric regression, there's an unknown function f. So in equation 1, the function of the overall model is unknown, obviously because it's a non-parametric approach. That is estimated through a kernel function k. So basically in the kernel regression, it is important to remember that at every individual data point, there is a kernel function through which the relationship is defined. So the kernel function can, here we have taken, it can either be Gaussian kernel or it can be a Panichnikov kernel. However, in the overall model, obviously the functional form is unknown because of the non-parametric method that we have taken. And the kernel regression, it basically relies on two things: the choice of the kernel function and the smoothing parameter or the bandwidth selection. And the smoothing parameter, which basically smoothens the curve that we have, it is basically derived from the data. However, here, it's important to remember that the choice of the kernel is not that important and it does not make much of a difference. However, the choice of bandwidth will make a lot of difference and it can skew the results a lot. In a non-parametric estimation, for the continuous variables, as I said that we have used two kernel functions, a Panashnikov kernel and Gaussian kernel. In equations 2 and 3, you can see the forms of these kernel functions, where where alpha is the smoothing parameter. Moving on, in equation 4, you can see how the bandwidth and the kernel function, which are defined in terms of alpha, they are associated. Here, xi are the observed values of the predictor variable, x is the unknown, and alpha is the smoothing parameter. We have used kernel functions proposed by Racine and Lee for the non-metric variables, as I specified that time, that is year, and country, these are the non-metric variables. And country obviously is the unordered categorical variable and year is the ordered one. And lambda is the smoothing parameter here, and it lies between 0 and 1. Apart from the non-parametric estimations that we have made, I'll come on to the results and the tables that we have got right after this slide. We have also made parametric estimations, and we have mainly used mean group and common correlated effects mean group estimations, which are as proposed by Passar in 2006. We have done this only for the comparison purpose because we got a satisfactory result from the non-parametric methods. That is why we use just for the comparison to just confirm our results through the parametric estimations also. So that was the only purpose for the parametric estimation. Research question 1 was regarding the causal direction. Here, the inferences, they are based on statistics Z tilde and Z bar, and Z bar is only applicable to the balanced panel, is not applicable to the unbalanced panel. And as you see here, the significance values, they clearly show that there is a bidirectional causality that exists between cross-border electricity trade and renewable energy production. Regarding the research question 2, which was the kernel regression, non-parametric regression, the first panel here shows the estimation with a Panashnikov kernel, and the second panel shows the estimation with the Gaussian kernel. As I specified before also, the results will be mostly similar because the choice of the kernel does not make much of a difference here. So if I summarize the results, the results of panel grandeur causality showed that there's a bidirectional causality that exists between cross-border electricity trade and renewable energy generation. The non-parametric estimation kernel regression shows that the cross-border trade in electricity positively and it significantly affects the renewable energy expansion. Output also positively and significantly affects the renewable energy generation, and the country and the time effects were also significant. The comparative models, the parametric models, the mean group and the common correlated effects mean group model that we used, they also show results that are similar to the non-parametric ones, thus confirming our results. Talking of the implications, from the study, it is implied that the cross-border electricity trade should be promoted in order to support renewable energy generation. And the growth in renewable energy production, it would not only promote sustainable development, but it would also help in achieving energy security, and the barriers that are there in the renewable energy production, they can be overcome by the cross-border electricity trade. The study advocates for policy intervention to promote the cross-border electricity trade, and the policy intervention must address barriers such as the diverging interests, administrative problems, the price distortions that I talked about in the introduction as well, and inadequate financing that is available in less developed countries. These should be sorted out through policy intervention in order to promote cross-border electricity trade. Talking of the limitations and future scope, energy prices, which are important determinants in cross-border electricity trade, and concerns regarding stability of prices and revenues. They may be the reasons why some countries block electricity inflows at the borders. However, our study is limited in the sense that this pricing information that is not included in the study, it is beyond the scope of the present work. However, we are making some changes to the existing study, and we are seeking to include this aspect too. However, it's not included in the present work that I've presented. However, the study may be extended by incorporating the variables that capture price differential across countries. And in the interest of economic and environmental sustainability, any pricing stability issue that arises out of market expansion, that must be dealt with appropriate market intervention by the partners that are trading. These are the references. Thank you.
Thank you, Arushi.
Thank you.
Also, we do have 5 minutes left in this session. So I'm happy to take questions for Arushi or for other speakers. Yes, Tarun.
Thanks, Arushi. My question is for your presentation. So can you explain a little bit more the Granger causality test that you did? So A, what was the objective of the test? Was it just to establish if there is a bidirectional relationship or not? Because that seems fairly intuitive, right? That there is a bidirectional relationship. But what does the Granger causality test tell us beyond that, and how exactly did you fix it? And secondly, from the results that you got from the non-parametric estimation, how can you really interpret? So how strong are these relationships? What is the relation? Can we say something more about the relationship itself?
Yes. So talking about the panel Granger causality, that was an initial test. We just wanted to establish whether there's a bidirectional causality between the variables. And later on, we did the non-parametric estimations. It was just an initial thing that we did in order to establish whether there's a bidirectional causality, and more deeper interpretations could be made from the kernel regression that I specified in the table. Regarding non-parametric estimation, the kernel regression, yes, we found strong significant effects, and we also found that with regarding the time and the country effects, we found that because if you see in the table, it's shown as the time has a negative coefficient. That's only because we have taken the data actually from it's in the descending order, 2018, 2017, 2016 till 1990. That's why it has a negative coefficient. However, it means that we interpret that with time the renewable energy expansion is taking place. And yes, we have strong significant effects, if I answered your question.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I was more interested in the Granger causality, and I wasn't sure if more can be done.
That was just an initial thing. More interpretations and obviously could be made from the kernel regression. That was just an initial thing.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I saw a question in chat, so I will just answer here. So if we think that there are only 2 technologies, like the renewables and the traditional technologies, so okay, so the question is,
can you tell us what's the question? Yes, please.
Yes, so the question is, what are the factors that determine the extent to which reserves would increase? If you could expand those intuitively, that would be great. Okay, so the intuition is that if the availability factor, so the phi of the expectation of phi is very low, it means that the availability of the renewables will be very low in expectation. So in this case, you will see that the value of the renewables will low, like it becomes less attractive. Because if you pay for the renewables, but when you need it, it's not available, then the value of the renewables will low. And in this case, and in order to satisfy the demand, you have to buy more reserves from the traditional generation. So that is the intuition. It's like, yeah,
I get that, and in fact, that's very interesting because like there's a whole the literature that I work with which talks about reduction in value of renewables, but from a day-ahead market perspective. So we have all there. That's quite established that as the amount of renewables in the system increases, the value of renewables in terms of the price they can earn in the market decreases. So that probably ties up well with your arguments around reserves. But my question really was, because you said the amount of reserves would need to increase, but we can't really say by how much. But it would still be nice to understand by how much would depend on certain things which are not simply, oh, how much am I willing to pay for it? Because then it's again something that's not really necessarily depend on renewables and it's something from outside the system. But like what are the, like to what extent is the renewables that is causing reserve requirement, or to what extent is the setup of the market or the model itself that's causing this? Wasn't very clear to me. And if that can be explained more intuitively in the paper or presentation, that would be just great. So, but
I see your point, but I don't consider like the difference of market design. Like if it's the set of the markets affects the elasticity of reserves or the renewables. Yeah, so you mean like there are many other factors that may affect the results? Or I see, but I don't consider it in my model. Yeah, thank you. I will consider about that. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are just on time, I think, because it's 10:30. And so I want to thank you all for your very interesting work and very clear presentations. I hope that, if somebody wants to continue talking in the chat, that's possible. Otherwise, well, it's not an in-person conference, so there is not much time to chat over the coffee break, but we have each other's email on the presentation. So hopefully if somebody wants to continue the debate, that's always possible, and I would encourage you to do so. Otherwise, because most of you are doctoral students, good luck with the continuation and with the finishing of your thesis. Good luck to all of you, and thank you for attending.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.